Imagine your ex-wife introduces you to her billionaire husband, hoping to embarrass you weeks. Later you discover that same man secretly owns the building where you work. Sounds unbelievable, right? But that's only the beginning, because what happens next changes 3 lives forever, and the final decision will leave you questioning what real success actually means. Stay with me, because every minute of this story completely changes the one before it. Some stories sound too strange to be real. A woman parades her brand new, wildly wealthy husband in front of the ex-husband she once called a failure, hoping to humiliate him one last time, and ends up handing him the very key that saves her daughter's entire future. Stay with me until the very end, because the last few minutes of this story will change the way you think about pride, money, and the quiet kind of dignity that never asks for applause. And if stories like this move you the way they move me, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on my notifications, because you will not want to miss what happens next. This is the story of Daniel Reyes, a single father, a mall maintenance supervisor, and a man who was about to discover that the universe has a peculiar sense of humor. At 5:40 in the morning, 3 hours before Rosewood Grand Mall opened its doors to the public, Daniel Reyes was already inside, walking the empty marble corridors with a flashlight clipped to his belt and a radio crackling softly at his hip. The mall at that hour felt like a cathedral abandoned by its congregation. Fountains, silent escalators still, the storefronts dark behind their metal gates. Daniel liked it this way. There was a peace in being the first person to hear a building breathe, to notice the flicker in a light fixture on the second floor before a single customer complained about it too. Fix a leaking pipe near the food court before the smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls covered any trace that something had gone wrong. He was 34 years old with the kind of face that looked perpetually tired even after 8 hours of sleep. Though 8 hours of sleep store was a luxury he rarely got anymore. His skin held a warm olive tan from years of summers spent outdoors before life became mostly fluorescent lighting and drop ceilings. His dark brown hair was cut short and neat, faded at the sides because he trimmed it himself in the bathroom mirror to save the $25 a barber would charge a little stubble. Always shadowed his jaw by Steens the end of a shift. He wore the same uniform every day, a navy blue polo with Rosewood Grand Mall facilities embroidered over the left side of his chest, dark work jeans, white sneakers scuffed at the toes, a plain silver wristwatch that had belonged to his own father, and a laminated badge clipped to his collar that read, D. Reyes Facilities Supervisor. He had held that job for 6 years. It was not the career he had once imagined for himself, but it was steady. And steady was what mattered now, because at home in a small 2-bedroom apartment 15 minutes from the mall, an 8-year-old girl named Mia was waiting for her father to walk through the jade every evening with the particular kind of hope only children carry, the hope that today he'd have enough time to help her practice her handwriting, or watch one more episode of her favorite week cartoon, or simply sit at the table and ask her with his full attention how her day had gone. Mia had dark hair that her father had learned through trial, error, and 3 ruined school mornings to braid into 2 neat pigtails. She had her mother's sharp brown eyes and her father's stubborn chin and a gap in her front teeth that made her smile look like sunlight breaking through a crack in the clouds. She was without question the reason Daniel got out of bed every single day, the reason he swallowed his pride at a job some people considered beneath him, the reason he had never once let his daughter see him defeated, even on the nights when defeat was the only thing he could taste. 6 years earlier, Daniel had owned a small business, a custom furniture and cabinetry shop he had built with his own hands. Quite literally, starting with a garage and a set of tools inherited from his father. For 4 years it had done well enough. He and his then-wife Vanessa had a modest but comfortable life, a rented house with a small yard weekend, trips to the lake, the kind of small joys that never make it into anyone's highlight reel but hold a dias. Marriage together all the same. He remembered still the smell of fresh-cut oak in that garage. The way Vanessa used to bring him iced tea in the evenings and sit on an overturned crate just to talk while he sanded a tabletop. The two of them, young enough to believe that steady effort was the only ingredient a good life required. Then the recession hit small contractors hardest. 2 of those biggest clients, defaulted on payments they owed him. The bank pulled his line of credit without warning. Within 18 months, the shop he had poured his heart into was gone, along with almost everything the two of them had saved. Vanessa had not married him for money. Daniel wanted to believe that, still believed it most days, but she had married him, believing in a future that suddenly evaporated. The argument started small about grocery, bills, and unpaid invoices, and grew into something colder, something that no longer felt like two people trying to solve a problem together, but two people quietly keeping score. 2 years after the shop closed, Vanessa filed for divorce. She said she needed stability. She said she couldn't keep living paycheck to paycheck, waiting for a comeback that might never come. Daniel didn't fight her on it. Not really, because some small, exhausted part of him agreed with everything she said. He took a job at Rosewood Grand Mall 3 weeks later, first as a general maintenance technician, and within a year was promoted to supervisor. It didn't pay what his shop once had. It didn't come with prestige, but it came with health insurance for Mia, a fixed schedule that let him be home for dinner most nights, and the quiet satisfaction of a job done honestly. Vanessa remarried within 2 years. Daniel heard about it the way people hear most things about their exes now, secondhand, through a mutual friend, then confirmed through a stiff, polite phone call about updating Mia's pickup schedule. Her new husband was by every account wealthy. Not comfortable wealthy, genuinely, seriously wealthy. The kind of wealthy where the word budget simply didn't apply to daily life anymore. His name was Richard Calloway. Daniel wasn't the only one who leaned on someone else to get through the harder stretches on the maintenance crew. There was Tony Alvarez, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s who had worked at Rosewood Grand since before Daniel was hired, and who had appointed himself without ever being asked as something between a mentor and an older brother. It was Tony who noticed one slow Tuesday afternoon, while they replaced ceiling tiles near the food court, that Daniel had been unusually quiet. "You're doing that thing again," Tony said, not looking up from his work. "The thing where you go somewhere else in your head and don't come back for 20 minutes. Daniel almost laughed. "Vanessa wants me to meet the new husband. Officially. As a family," she said. Tony set down his tile and looked at him. "Properly. And you're worried he's going to be some Wall Street type who looks at you like you're the help, something like that. Let me tell you something. My father told me," Tony said, wiping his hands on wall said. "A man's worth was never in his bank account. It's in whether people can count on him. You've never once let that little girl down. Let the rich guy worry about whether he can say the same about that himself." Daniel thought about that conversation more than once in the weeks that followed, especially on the evening of the dinner. They met at an upscale restaurant downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a wine list thicker than the menu, the kind of place Daniel would never have chosen for himself. He came straight from a 10-hour shift, having only had time to swap his work polo for a plain button-down shirt in the mall's employee restroom, the outline of his navy blue facilities badge still faintly visible in the crease, marks on his collar where it usually clipped. Vanessa arrived looking exactly like the after-4 photo in a magazine transformation: hair, sleek and straightened, a fitted emerald dress, small, diamond studs catching the restaurant's warm light. Beside her stood Richard Calloway, a man in his mid-40s, silver threading elegantly through dark hair, a charcoal 3-piece suit that fits him the way expensive things fit people who never had to think about the price of a platinum watch. That alone probably cost more than Daniel's yearly salary. He had the kind of calm, settled presence that Daniel associated with men who had never once had to explain themselves to a bank manager. "Daniel," Vanessa said, her voice pitched with the particular brightness she used when she wanted an audience to notice how gracious she was being. "This is Richard. This is Mia's father." Richard extended a hand, firm, warm, "Good to finally meet you," he said, and there was nothing in his tone that suggested condescension. If anything, his eyes held a kind of quiet curiosity, studying Daniel the way a man studies something he hasn't yet decided how to categorize. Vanessa, however, could not resist over-appetizers. She steered the conversation, as she often did, toward comparison. "Daniel's still at the mall," she said lightly to Richard, swirling her wine. "Doing the maintenance thing, very hands-on." She said it the way someone might describe a hobby, a grown man should have outgrown by now. Daniel felt the familiar heat rise in his neck, the old instinct to defend himself, to list his promotions, his responsibilities. The 11-person crew, he now states, managed the fact that half the mall's HVAC system would fail within a week without him. He said, none of it. Instead, he simply said, it's good, steady work, keeps a roof over Mia's head. He glanced at his daughter's photo on his phone screen for a half second. A habit, a grounding. Richard, notably, did not laugh, did not smirk, did not join Vanessa's tone. Instead, he asked genuinely, what's the hardest part of running facilities for a building that size? And when Daniel, surprised, answered honestly about aging infrastructure, about balancing 40 different tenant needs, about the invisible labor that keeps a public space functioning without anyone noticing. Richard listened with the attentiveness of a man who valued competence wherever he found it, regardless of title. 2 weeks later came the school function Vanessa had originally used as the excuse for the introduction Mia Spring Showcase, where second graders performed a slightly off-key musical number about the water cycle. Daniel arrived early, as he always did, and claimed a seance. The front Vanessa and Richard arrived a few minutes later, and to Daniel's quiet surprise, Richard did not stay glued to his phone the way Daniel expected a busy executive might teen. He watched the two entire performance with open, unguarded attention, and when Mia spotted her father in the crowd afterward and ran to him first, arms out, Richard hung back respectfully, letting the moment tire alone before stepping forward to offer Mia a small, genuine compliment about her solo line. It was a small thing, it shouldn't have mattered, but it planted in Daniel a confusing, unwanted seed of respect for a man he had every reason to resent. It should have been 2 small, forgettable evenings. Instead, they planted 2 seeds that would not fully bloom for several more months in Daniel, a grudging, complicated respect for a man he wanted to dislike and couldn't quite manage to, and in Richard, a quiet growing interest in a father whose steadiness seemed to run far deeper than his own bank account ever could. The trouble started a few weeks after that, and it started as trouble often does, with paperwork. Vanessa called on a Sunday afternoon, her voice carrying the particular carefulness of someone about to deliver unwelcome news wrapped in reasonable-sounding logic. Richard's company was expanding operations into another state. It made sense, she explained, for them to relocate better schools, a bigger house opportunities Mia would never have here. She wanted to revisit the custody agreement, and she'd already scheduled a mediation appointment with a family attorney for the following month. Daniel sat, very still on his worn living room couch, the phone pressed hard against his ear, and felt something in his chest cave inward. Mia was in the next room, humming to herself while she colored, utterly unaware that the ground beneath her small, ordinary life was being quietly renegotiated by adults over the phone. She's my daughter too, Daniel said, keeping his voice level. With tremendous effort, you can't just move her 3 states away and call it a school upgrade. Nobody's trying to shut you out, Daniel, Vanessa said, though the words felt hollow, even as she spoke. We just think Richard, and I think that Mia deserves more than what you can currently offer her. The sentence lodged itself somewhere behind Daniel's ribs and stayed there for days. He didn't sleep well that week. He caught himself standing in front of the Parmall's breakroom mirror more than once, staring at his own reflection in his navy polo, wondering, in his lowest moments, if she was right. That same week, a different kind of pressure arrived at work. Rumors had been circulating through Rosewood Grand Mall for months, whispers among tenants and staff that the aging property, hemorrhaging revenue as 2 anchor stores had recently closed, was being quietly shopped around to investors. Corporate ownership had been evasive in meetings, refusing to confirm or deny anything, but everyone could read the signs: reduced maintenance budgets, delayed repairs, a hiring freeze that had left Daniel's already thin crew stretched to breaking point. If the mall sold to the wrong buyer, one interested in demolishing it for condos or gutting it and laying off the entire operational staff to cut costs, Daniel's steady, unglamorous, life-saving job could disappear overnight. He didn't tell Vanessa any of this, pride mostly, but also a genuine fear that any hint of instability in his income would become another weapon in the So he kept showing up at 5:40 each morning, kept fixing what needed fixing, Kept smiling at Mia over cereal bowls as though the ground wasn't shifting under both of his feet. At once his marriage's aftermath and his livelihood, both hanging by threads. He couldn't see the ends of. Tony noticed the strain again, and this time Daniel told him almost everything, sitting on overturned buckets in the loading dock during their lunch break. "You survived worse than this," Tony told him, unwrapping a sandwich. "You survived losing the shop. You survived the divorce. This is just one more storm. You keep your head down. You keep doing right by that girl. And storms pass. Daniel, they always pass." The corporate walkthrough was scheduled for a Thursday. Mall management sent a memo 2 days prior, terse and vague, instructing all department heads to have their area's presentation ready for a visit from ownership representatives. Nobody used the word inspection, but everybody understood that's exactly what it was. Daniel spent 2 full days with his crew patching drywall in the East Wing, replacing 3 burnt-out fixtures near the food court, making sure every fire extinguisher tag was current, every emergency exit unobstructed. He wanted the building to look the way it deserved to look, regardless of who was walking through it or why. That was simply who he was. On Thursday morning, Daniel was on a ladder in the mall's central atrium, replacing a flickering panel in the massive skylight fixture that had been bothering him for 2 weeks, when he heard the click of expensive shoes on marble below and the low murmur of a small entourage. The mall's general manager, visibly as nervous, 2 men in suits Daniel didn't recognize, and a third figure whose voice, when it finally spoke, stopped Daniel's hands completely still on the ladder rung above him. "This atrium," the voice said, calm, assured, unmistakably familiar, "needs better lighting design. Whoever handles maintenance here clearly knows what they're doing, though I noticed the whole East Wing's been freshly patched. That's not typical for a property this age." Daniel looked down. Richard Calloway stood in the atrium of Rosewood Grand Mall in a tailored navy suit, flanked by the general team manager, who was practically vibrating with deference, addressing him not as Sir out of generic corporate politeness, but as Mr. Calloway, the way people address someone whose name is on the deed. For a long moment, neither man said anything. Daniel climbed down the ladder slowly, his mind scrambling to reassemble a version of reality that made sense. Richard Calloway, his daughter's stepfather, the man who had shaken his hand over white tablecloths months earlier, was not simply wealthy in some abstract, unrelated way. He owned Rosewood Grand Mall. He had in fact purchased it 8 months earlier through a holding company, quietly, the way serious investors often do, specifically to avoid the kind of tenant panic and staff turnover that comes when a name becomes public too early. Not even Vanessa knew the details of which properties sat inside Richard's portfolio. He kept business and home deliberately, carefully separate, a habit from years of watching wealthier acquaintances get exploited by people who married them for exactly this kind of information. Neither of them, not Daniel, worried sick about losing an anonymous faceless job to an anonymous faceless buyer, and not Richard, unaware that the maintenance supervisor head quietly admired at a dinner was the same steady hand keeping his newest acquisition standing, had known the other half of the story. Daniel, Richard said, and for the first time since Daniel had met him, the man's composed exterior cracked slightly with genuine, unguarded surprise. "You own this place," Daniel said. It wasn't a question. It came out flat, disbelieving the sound of a man watching 2 separate terms of his life suddenly merge into one. "I do," Richard admitted. "As of 8 months ago, I had no idea. You worked here. Vanessa's never mentioned." He stopped himself, visibly recalibrating. Ches never mentioned where specifically, the general manager, sensing the air had shifted into something far above his understanding, quietly excused himself and the 2 other suits toward the food court, leaving Daniel and Richard alone beneath the atrium's flickering skylight. Very fixture Daniel had been repairing when the world rearranged itself. What followed was not the confrontation either man might have expected months earlier, back when they were still strangers wearing each other's assumptions like ill-fitting coats. Richard asked Daniel to walk with him, and for nearly an hour, the 2 men toured the building together, Richard asking real questions, this time no longer polite, dinner party curiosity, but the focused attention of an owner. Finally understanding what kept his investment breathing, Daniel answered honestly, showing him the aging boiler system that maintenance had been requesting funds to replace for 2 years. the understaffed security office, the leaking roof section above the old anchor store that no one had authorized him to fix, because capital repairs required sign-off from an owner nobody could ever reach. Why didn't corporate flag any of this to me directly? Richard asked, more to Mames himself than to Daniel, jaw tightening. Because the people between you and me, Daniel said, carefully, have spent the last year protecting their own numbers, not this building. I've been asking for that roof repair for 8 months. I finally just started patching it myself with what I had, because I wasn't going to let a tenant's ceiling collapse over a budget line. Richard was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that Daniel would replay in his mind for weeks afterward. You've been running this place better without authority than most people run things with all the glory in the world. There was no dramatic announcement, no movie-style reversal where Richard fired the incompetent management on the spot in front of a cheering crowd. Real accountability, Richard understood, took investigation, documentation, careful legal steps. But within 2 weeks, the general manager who had spent a year deflecting basic maintenance requests to protect his quarterly bonus was quietly replaced. The roof got fixed, the hiring and freeze lifted. Daniel Reyes was offered a newly created position, Director of Facilities Operations, overseeing not just Rosewood Grand, but 2 additional properties in Richard's portfolio, a role with a salary that for the first time in 6 years let Daniel breathe without doing math in his head at every grocery store checkout. Daniel almost said no, sitting across from Richard's HR director a few days later, reading the offer letter. An old familiar pride flared up in him, the fear that this was charity, a favor extended by a man married to his ex-wife, something that would make him feel small in a different way than being called the mall guy ever had. He called Tony that night, the letter still sitting unsigned on his kitchen table. You think this is a handout, Tony said, half laughing. Daniel has known you for 1 dinner and 1 hour-long walkthrough. Nobody hands a stranger 3 properties out of pity. He saw the work. That's not charity. That's finally somebody paying you what you were always worth. Daniel signed the letter. The next morning, he told his crew, before he told anyone else. He gathered them in the loading dock at the end of a shift. 11 tired, grease-stained people who had spent years being treated as an afterthought by every management company that ever ran Rosewood Grand, and he told them the truth. New ownership, real budgets, no more duct-taped fixes to problems that deserved real solutions. Tony clapped him on the back hard enough to sting one of the younger techs, a 19-year-old named Priya, who was putting herself through community college on this paycheck, actually teared up because Daniel's first request to the new ownership group hadn't been a bigger office or a company car. It had been a proposal to raise the crew's base wage and reinstate the tuition assistance program. Corporate had quietly cut 2 years earlier. You didn't have to ask for us first, Tony said quietly. After the others had filtered out, Daniel just shrugged. Seemed obvious, he said. None of what he saw in that walkthrough happened without you. At home that night, Daniel told Mia only the parts a 7-year-old could hold on to that. Daddy had a new job now, a better one still, at the same mall. She liked to visit for the carousel near the food court. Mia considered this gravely for a moment, then asked the only question that mattered to her. Does that mean you still pick me up on Fridays? When Daniel promised her, yes, always, she seemed satisfied enough to go back to coloring, and it struck him, watching her small head bent over a page of scribbled suns, that this was the entire point of everything he had just done. Not the salary, not the title, but one more. Ordinary Friday pickup, guaranteed for a little longer. The more important reckoning, though, happened in Vanessa's kitchen, 3 days after the walkthrough, when Richard told her the whole story, who Daniel really was to the business. Shed assumed was entirely separate from her personal life, and more pointedly, what had witnessed of Daniel's character in that hour-long walk through a building most owners never bothered to inspect at all. Vanessa sat with that information for a long time. To her credit, she didn't deflect it when she called Daniel that weekend. Her voice carried none of its usual polish. I said some things, she admitted, about what you could offer. Mia, I was wrong. I was measuring the wrong things. She paused. Richard told me what he saw. The roof, the 8 months of nobody listening to you. You kept doing right by that building and by Mia, even when nobody was watching or paying you extra to care. I should have known that already. I was married to it for 6 years before I decided it didn't count for enough. It wasn't a perfect, silly apology, and it didn't erase the sentence that had lodged behind Daniel's ribs for weeks. But it was honest, and honest was more than Daniel had expected to receive. The mediation appointment with the family attorney was quietly canceled. There was no need for a courtroom, no need for either side to bring in evidence of who could provide more. Instead, over 2 long conversations at Vanessa's kitchen table, the 3 of them, Daniel, Vanessa, and Richard, worked out a custody arrangement that put Mia's stability first, an arrangement built on Richard's quiet respect for Daniel rather than Vanessa's old anxious comparisons. The relocation plan itself quietly dissolved not long after, with Rosewood Grand finally profitable, and Richard reconsidering how deeply he wanted to be rooted in the community that had, in its own roundabout way, given him back something he hadn't known he was missing. The family decided to stay close to home. Months later, on a Saturday afternoon, Daniel stood in the same atrium where his entire world had been buys. No longer on a ladder, no longer in a maintenance polo, but in a simple, button-down shirt, watching Mia race across the marble floor toward the new indoor play area Rosewood Grand had finally been able to afford to build. Richard stood beside him, and for once, there was no tension in the space between them, just 2 men who had learned through the strangest and possible circumstances to respect what the other had built in entirely different currencies. "You know," Richard said, watching Mia climb, "I've owned 12 properties in my life. You're the first person who ever made me actually want to understand one of them." Daniel didn't have a rich comeback for that. He simply nodded, watching his daughter laugh under the skylight he'd once repaired alone at 5 in the morning, when no one was there to see it, when no one had promised him it would ever matter to anyone but her. That, in the end, was the quiet truth at the center of this whole story. Dignity was never something Daniel had needed anyone, not Vanessa, not Richard, not a title or a salary to hand. He had carried it with him the entire time in the unglamorous, unwitnessed work of fixing what was broken and showing up for the people who depended on him. Wealth had simply finally walked far enough into his life to notice, if Daniel's story teaches anything, that the value of a person is rarely visible in a job title or a bank statement. It shows up in the roof someone quietly repairs with their own hands. It shows up in the daughter someone braids pigtails for every morning before a 10-hour shift. It shows up in the honesty someone offers, even when a lie would be easier, and in the friend who reminds you on the loading dock during a 15-minute lunch break that storms always pass. Somewhere out there, a person doing unglamorous, thankless work today is building something no spreadsheet will ever capture. Keep going. Somebody eventually notices. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories like Daniel's, and let us know in the comments which moments hit you hardest. Well, see you in the next one.